So far, nearly 60 million early votes have already been cast across 47 states and the District of Columbia. Now, according to data from the University of Florida's election lab, that's 10 million more than the total early votes cast in either 2012, 2016, and I believe even 2020. And there's still 6 days to go. So what do we know so far from what we've seen in this data? Joining me now to break this down, Matt Carpenter, Director of FRC Action. Matt, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for the invite, Tony. Great to be with you.
All right, so other than record turnout so far, what else is the early voting data showing us in this election cycle?
So, Tony, kind of the meta trend overall is a dip in the number of mail-in ballots that have arrived. You look at a place like Georgia, right? In 2020, 1.3 million Georgians had voted by mail, and just now you look at it, less than 200,000. But if you look at those early in-person voting numbers, you see an uptick there. And so this is kind of, I think, indicative of maybe Republicans getting some confidence in voting early and kind of getting the idea that you vote early, you bank your vote, and then, you know, the campaign can spend resources looking after low propensity or no propensity voters. Another state, North Carolina, also has some interesting numbers there as well. You look at that drop off in vote by mail. Almost 1 million folks had voted by mail at this time in 2020, and similar to Georgia, almost less than 200,000 this time around. But you still see some very strong early in-person numbers there as well. So voters really like that early in-person option. I guess they might not trust the mailman. I don't know for sure, but going into the voting booth, filling in your bubbles, handing in your ballot. Voters are responding to that option. And they've been telling pollsters for a while now, typically, Republican voters prefer to vote in person and Democrat voters tend to vote by mail. We don't know how these voters are voting, but you can draw some inferences that you don't really get with standard head-to-head polling at this stage.
So let's break down by party. We do know in some places where the early voting is taking place by party. It appears to be that more Republicans in the 2024 election cycle are voting early.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, at this stage in 2020, I think the overall share of the early vote was about 40% Democrat and 36% Republican. This time around, it's actually 39% Democrat and 36 Republican. So it's the Democratic margin is shrinking a little bit here. We're seeing Republican enthusiasm across the board. Another place you look at, like a state like Pennsylvania, where they don't have typical kind of in-person voting. You don't just go into a precinct location before Election Day and vote in person, but you can go down to your precinct office, get an absentee ballot, vote by mail there in person. We're seeing a steady drop really across the board. And remember, Pennsylvania was a state in 2020. Joe Biden had banked, I think, a 1.1 million vote firewall going into Election Day that then Republicans had to overcome. Just a monumental task. And so this time around, that firewall is looking more like a 380,000 vote lead for Kamala Harris and Democrat candidates statewide in Pennsylvania. So, you know, frankly, the Republicans are in a much better position this time around than they were in 2020.
You know, that's very interesting, Matt, when we looked at the enthusiasm behind Harris after the Democratic convention, and, you know, she was kind of, you know, tapped and the media was all in. But then, you know, it appears that is stalling, and we're seeing now more enthusiasm on the Republican side. And I'm wondering if it isn't the just listening to her and what she is promoting. And I want to play this clip again of the president yesterday stepping on her speech on the Mall. But again, I think kind of an unvarnished view of how they look at conservatives. Play clip 3.
And just the other day, a speaker at his rally called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. Well, let me tell you something. I don't know the Puerto Rican that I know, or Puerto Rico where I'm in my home state of Delaware. They're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters.
That sounds so much like what Hillary Clinton said in 2016 about Trump supporters after he spoke at the Value Voter Summit. She called them deplorables. And that was a key part of tanking her candidacy.
Yeah, Tony, at this point, I think it's an American political tradition. You think about Barack Obama in 2008, I think it was, that said Pennsylvania voters were bitter and clinging to their guns and Bibles, right? I mean, it's almost like it's just part of our kind of presidential election tradition at this point that you have Democratic presidential candidates disparaging voters. And I completely agree with what you said earlier. This is just stepping all over the momentum for the Harris campaign. They were really hoping, if you watch some of her remarks at the Ellipse recently, she was hoping for a message of unity. She wanted to close out talking about what she might do for the economy. And now they're forced to backpedal. And it wasn't too recently ago that they were comparing Trump to fascist dictators. And so it just makes you wonder, they're overstepping on one side and then they're retreating and apologizing the next day. It's a ham-fisted response from the campaign. And if you're on the Kamala Harris campaign, you have to be worried about how she's closing out this election.
And of course, the White House and the media doing their best to try to sanitize his comments, saying they were taken out of context. And there's no way to take those comments out of context. All right, Matt, just have about a minute left. What resources are available for those who have not yet voted?
Yeah, so Tony, definitely want to encourage our listeners to download the Stand Firm app and get access to that toolkit that you've been mentioning. In that toolkit, you'll find voter guides for the presidential race, for Senate races in Arizona, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Florida, Texas, Virginia, Wisconsin. We've got House guides as well there. We've got information on pro-abortion ballot initiatives in 10 states. It's really important Christians be educated as to what's on their ballot. But I also want to just challenge your listeners, share that information. We've seen some studies from George Barna. There's a large number of Christians who could sit this election out, but we do know that they can be motivated to vote if you share information with them and encourage them to vote and let them know how important this election is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Matt Carpenter, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Tony.